Yep.
Great. Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second session of our three-part mini course, Racial Passing, Efforts to Belong and Assimilate in the United States, primarily through literary texts. And tonight's subtopic or topic is Roth, meaning Philip Roth, and Americana. I'm Nancy Sinkoff. I'm the academic director of the Alan and Joan Bildner Center for the Study of Jewish Life and a professor of Jewish Studies and History here at Rutgers, New Brunswick. And I'm so thrilled to have you here again for another fascinating excursion into this phenomenon of racial, ethnic, religious passing in the United States. This is a webinar format. All of you are muted. If you have a question, just ask it in the chat and I will make sure it gets asked. Sometimes I couple questions together, but they will be posed to our presenter, Dr. Donovan Ramon, in two sections of the talk, about 25 minutes into the talk and then towards the end. The mini course is, is being recorded, and you will be able to hear it again and share it after tonight when we upload it. It usually takes a couple of days. The last thing is, if you need closed captions, and I find them very useful actually, on your screen you can click at the bottom the CC or 3 dots, and that will enable closed captions on your screen. Our speaker tonight is the Bildner Visiting Scholar this semester, Dr. Donovan Ramon. He's an assistant professor of English at Southern Illinois at Edwardsville University. And he also earned his doctorate at Rutgers after earning a BA at Hunter College in the honors program. He is a specialist in African American and African diasporic literatures, and he's published articles on Philip Roth and Alice Dunbar Nelson, as well as editing of a special volume on Nella Larsen's passing. His first book, entitled Striking Features, Psychoanalysis and Racial Passing Narratives, will come out in February 2024. So please welcome again to our cyber stage, Professor Donovan Ramon. Today's topic again is Roth and Americana. Thanks so much.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you to the Bildner Center and Professor Nancy Sinkoff for curating this series. Tonight, as Professor Sinkoff said, we will focus on Philip Roth, a quintessential New Jersey writer. His 2000 novel, The Human Stain, encapsulates some of the themes we discussed last week, including Jewishness and Americana. Tonight's session will unfold in 3 parts. In part 1, we will discuss the excerpt we read for tonight. Then we will address the text as a whole and its depiction of racialized identities. In part 3, I'll invoke psychoanalysis and Roth himself to shed more perspective on the novel. I shall carefully walk us through the text as we seek to understand efforts to belong and assimilate in the United States and Roth's part of that depiction. Next slide, please. First, let's begin with Philip Roth himself. Before we get into the text, let's begin with Roth himself. I'm sorry, the second slide, please. Philip Roth was born in 1933 and died in New York City in 2018. He was a prolific post-war Jewish American writer, best known for his novels and short stories. After transferring from Rutgers Newark, he earned a bachelor's degree in English at Bucknell University in Pennsylvania and a master's degree in English from University of Chicago in 1955. Afterwards, he emerged as a prolific fiction writer and frequent award winner. His best-known works include Goodbye Columbus and 5 short stories from 1959, Portnoy's Complaint, 1969, The Ghostwriter, 1979, and the Prague Orgy in 1985. Next slide, please. And of course, his American Trilogy series, which includes novels that explore aspects of Americana, including race, morality, and political correctness. His second book in the trilogy, I Married a Communist from 1998, centers on characters dealing with McCarthy-era communism, whereas his first book in the trilogy is American Pastoral from 1997, which uses the Vietnam War as a backdrop for Seymour Levoff, a Jewish businessman whose life is undone in the 1960s. As you see in the image here, the 3 texts in the order of the publication: American Pastoral, 1997, I Married a Communist from 1998, and The Human Stain from 2000. I just mentioned them in a different order here, but you'll see why in a minute. The text also references the Civil Rights Movement, the Watergate scandal, and the 1967 Newark race riots as backdrops. Indeed, Newark specifically and New Jersey as a whole both center prominently in Philip Roth's writing. Let's turn to a resonant passage from American Pastoral, the one that we read for tonight on the Building Center website, on the next slide. I'm going to read, I know it's hard to see, but I'm going to read just that paragraph right in the middle. The Jewishness that he wore so lightly as one of the tall, blonde, athletic winners must have spoken to us too, and are idolizing the Swede and his unconscious oneness with America. I suppose there was a tinge of shame and self-rejection. Conflicting Jewish desires awakened by the sight of him were simultaneously becalmed by him. The contradiction in Jews who want to fit in and want to stand out, who insist they are different and insist they are no different, resolved itself in a triumphant spectacle of this Swede, who was actually only another of our neighborhood Seymours, whose forebears had been Solomons and Sauls, and who would themselves beget Stephens, who would in turn beget Shawns. Where was the Jew in him? He couldn't find it, and yet you knew it was there. Where was the irrationality in him? Where was his crybaby in him? Where was the wayward temptations? No guile, no artifice, no mischief. All that he had eliminated to achieve his perfection. No striving, no ambivalence, no doubleness, just a style, the natural physical refinement of a star. In this passage, Roth's protagonist, Nathan Zuckerman, helps us to meditate on Jewishness and Americana using the image of, quote, the Swede. This is a nickname given to Seymour because of his blonde hair and Nordic good looks. He assumes a typical American life as a family man and a businessman in wealthy Morris County, New Jersey. In doing so, as the text indicates, he minimizes his Jewishness and becomes, quote, one with America, unquote. He enjoys a quiet middle-class life at the expense of his Jewish identity, and there is always something within him that others assume, even as the narrator asks for, quote, the Jew within him, unquote. Is this an example of passing, of assimilation, of passivity about one's background? I'll leave it for you to speculate. Of course, after you read the entire novel, welcome your speculations on what this is here. What's clear, though, is that this novel and the series as a whole raises questions of what it means to have an ethnic and or racialized identity in the United States. We see these questions even more prominently in the last text from this series, The Human Stain from 2000, where the question isn't about where's the hidden Jew, but where is the hidden African American? Next slide, please. As the third and final book in this series, The Human Stain updates the historical references to center Bill Clinton's affair and all the moralizing that occurred as a result. What unites the three texts are questions of Americana, as well as, more locally, Nathan Zuckerman, who serves as a narrator for each story. Nathan is actually a fictional representation of our author, Philip Roth himself. In The Human Stain, the main character is Coleman Silk, a classics professor who asks Nathan to write his life story on his behalf. So I want to be clear about this distinction here. The narrator is Nathan Zuckerman, who is the one who's telling us the story. He's telling us the story of the main character, who is Coleman Silk, who's Coleman Silk. The excerpt we read for today comes from the beginning of the book, which introduces us to other pertinent characters as well, and I'm going to summarize them here. Faunia Farley, the young cleaning lady with whom Coleman has been having an affair, and Delphine Roux, the woman who succeeded Coleman as dean of faculty at the fictional Athena University. But as Nathan Zuckerman, Roth's fictional alter ego and Coleman's neighbor, who narrates the story. As you see in today's excerpt, chapter 1 is entitled Everyone Knows, which has multiple meanings in this narrative. The events of the novel occurred in 1998 and clearly highlights Americana, and especially the political correctness of the Bill Clinton era. On the first few pages alone, we see references to the American flag, which flies at the post office that employs Faunia. Faunia herself is described on the first page as representing, quote, New England's harsh beginnings, resembling stone colonial women locked up, unquote. America comes up again in the opening section, particularly in reference to sanctimony, baseball's home run battle that summer of 1998, and Nathaniel Hawthorne, a quintessential American writer who, quote, in the 1860s lived not many miles from my door, unquote, according to our narrator, Nathan Zuckerman. This reference to Hawthorne is very telling, for he too invoked history and morality in his writings on early America. The Human Stain, then, uses the Clinton sex scandal to frame what's happening in the United States at the time. The scandal provides the larger backdrop for the more local scandal that engulfs the bucolic New England town, which Nathan reveals in the opening paragraph. He tells us that 71-year-old former professor and dean Coleman Silk has been having an affair with Faunia Farley, a cleaning woman. One of Walk's goal in the American trilogy is to force readers to grapple with American morality, which he achieves by contrasting Silk's actions to Clinton's. In both cases, powerful men have affairs with women who are way younger than they are, before public humiliation and scorn take over. Now, last week, I mentioned that the United States is invested in duality, which Roth literalizes in the introduction, which we read for tonight, because two things become abundantly clear in the opening pages of The Human Stain. One, again, the book is very much steeped in Americana, which refers to all the ways in which the United States, its civilization and culture are portrayed. And two, there are a few levels of secrecy going on, and Coleman's affair is just the beginning. So, meaning in his chapter entitled Everyone Knows, that's the beginning chapter, but the narrative unfolds in terms of what everyone knows and when. And there's more about we're going to learn more about what everyone knows. It's not just Coleman's sexual proclivities. Indeed, the most prominent duality in the text is actually a racial one, as we see on page 6 of our excerpt. I'm going to point us to the second paragraph of page 6. This second paragraph begins with Nathan observing that, quote, Coleman was one of a handful of Jews on the Athena faculty when he was hired, unquote, decades ago. Later on in this paragraph, we learn that he made history, quote, as the first and only Jew ever to serve at Athena as dean of faculty, unquote. Over the years, he emerged as a prominent Jewish administrator and professor of classics. But what we don't get in today's excerpt is the full scope of his racial background. Coleman Silk is actually a light-skinned African-American and not a Jewish American. He passed, and in his adulthood, he passed as a Jew, but he was actually born as an African-American. Next slide, please. Given Coleman's Black heritage, the scene I'm about to show is quite ironic. It comes from the movie adaptation of The Human Stain from 2003, where, of all people, Sir Anthony Hopkins plays Coleman Silk in his old age. So I'm going to turn it over to Sarah, who's going to share the link from YouTube. It's a 2-minute link, 2-minute clip of The Human Stain, the opening scene of The Human Stain, the movie, which of course is adapted from the book.
Sorry, hold on one sec. I'm just trying to somehow locate it in my share. It does not want to come up. So one sec.
No worries.
Let me try again. Apologize. It is. I'm not coming up with the option here to share my internet.
Uh-oh.
Oh, let's see. Wait, hold on. Ah, got it. Here we go. Let me just make sure. You know what? One sec. Let me try this one more time. I want to make sure that the share is optimized for video clips. Okay, now we can do it.
Okay. So again, this is the opening of The Human Stain, the movie from 2003.
Mrs. Cummings, Tracy Cummings, can you tell us? Still not here. Okay, Mr. Thomas, William Thomas. See here. We're 5 weeks into the semester, and I haven't even laid eyes on these folks. Can anyone tell me, do these people exist? Or are they spooks?
Were you aware, Professor Silk, that Tracy Cummings and William Thomas were African Americans?
How could I be? Never seen them.
But you are aware of the connotation of the word spook.
Ghost, Professor Rule, ghost. I was referring to their ectoplasmic character. Here's the first definition of the word. I quote, spook, informal, ghost, spectre.
But Dean Silk, let me remind you of the second definition. Derogatory, Negro.
I'd never laid eyes on them. How could I know they were black? All I did know was that they were invisible.
Nevertheless, they have lodged a complaint. Miss Cummings was devastated. Now, the issue here...
These students have never attended a single class. Do they exist, or are they spooks? Consider the context.
But Dean...
I've not finished! The only issue is the non-attendance of these students, their inexcusable neglect of work, and their sheer chutzpah. Oh, Miss Cummings is devastated. Give me a break, will you? To charge me with racism is not only false, it is spectacularly false. And you know it! Thanks a lot, Herb.
Okay, thank you. That's actually the only link I'm going to show tonight from the movie The Human Stain. I'm honest, I like the book better. If you saw the movie, I'd be interested in hearing what your thoughts are at the end, if you compare and contrast the movie and the book. As I said earlier, Anthony Hopkins plays an older Coleman Silk. Anthony Hopkins is not a light-skinned African-American, but the protagonist of the book is a light-skinned African-American. Young Coleman Silk is played by Wentworth Miller. And I'll let you do with that what you will in terms of stylistic choices from Hollywood. At any rate, what we see in this clip, in his lecture on the beginnings of Western literature, I'm sorry, and if you, this scene that you just saw is encapsulated on page 7 of the PDF, page 7 of the PDF. So in his lecture on the beginnings of Western literature, Coleman Silk ends by taking attendance and calling absent students spooks. According to him, he was referring to the absence only, but it was also a derogatory term for African Americans. He did not know that the absent students were Black or that he referred to them using old racist terminology. Let's pay close attention to the diction in this scene. Silk marks his Jewishness by uttering chutzpah and taps his black colleague's shoulder at the end, sarcastically uttering, "Thanks for the support, Herb." Herb Keeble was the first Black faculty Silk hired as dean years ago, and now anticipates his support during this accusation of racism. But as you can see in the scene, he cannot even look at Coleman Silk during this meeting. Perhaps Coleman felt an affinity to Herb because he hired him, or because he is visibly African American. If Coleman spent his career as a Black scholar instead of a Jewish one, maybe his colleagues would agree that the charge of racism is, quote, spectacularly false, as is claimed in the clip we just saw. However, to them, he is a Jewish professor who made a racially insensitive remark. In a novel about America's morality and political correctness, this particular scene raises questions about race, identity, academia, and what else it is that, to quote the chapter's title, everyone knows. What didn't help Coleman's defense against racism is how despised he is at Athena. As pages 8 to 10 of our excerpt details, he made his colleagues justify their positions. He ended Athena notes to encourage them to publish outside the university and establish scholarly journals. He forced them to formally apply for research leave time and made it difficult for professors to get promoted. Nathan cites one of Coleman's enemies in the middle of page 10. Quote, "In short, he brought in competition. He made the place competitive, which, as an early enemy noted, is what Jews do," unquote. There's more. And whenever an angry ad hoc committee was formed to go and complain to Pierce Roberts, the president of the university, unfailingly backed Coleman, unquote. Here, this enemy has invoked an old stereotype about Jews being competitive to justify Coleman's leadership as dean. In this case, it wasn't Coleman himself who was competing, but the university he represented. Because of all of this, when the faculty hear of Black students lodging complaints against him, they are largely nonchalant. I've spent some time on this opening scene because it really lays the foundation for Coleman Silk, the man who was always on the border of Blackness and Jewishness in the text. His life and career begin to unravel after the accusation of racism, as you see in this scene. On page 11, Nathan informs us that Iris Silk, his wife, Iris Silk dies, which we later find out Coleman blamed on the stress of the allegation, and that Coleman and Nathan come from the same New Jersey area. Turning to page 11, Coleman grew up, quote, in the tiny Essex County town of East Orange, New Jersey, and that as a 1944 graduate of East Orange High School, he had been some 6 years ahead of me in my neighboring Newark school. At the end of the excerpt, when Coleman is banging on Nathan's door, it's because he wants Nathan, a writer, to write Coleman's story. The rest of the novel, The Human Stain, is indeed Coleman's fascinating story. For the second part of this presentation, I'll focus on the Black and Jewish dualities that Coleman maintained. In his youth, he had a complicated relationship with his distant yet demanding father, Mr. Silk, who is a dominating presence in the Silk household. He remains out of the home for extended stretches of at a time, working long hours for the Pennsylvania Railroad. When at home, Mr. Silk enjoys reading canonical literature and encourages his children to consume it as well. This love of the classics also helped him to speak in very precise ways. As Nathan noted, Mr. Silk, quote, never lost his temper, but had another way of beating you down with words, with speech, unquote. He encourages his children to maintain a well-rounded curriculum, which motivates Coleman to become a formidable classics professor. Yet Mr. Silk's idealized quest to have his children love the English language as much as he does also smothers them and prevents their growth in other crucial areas, including race. Indeed, even though Mr. Silk worked as a Pullman porter, a job exclusively for African Americans serving white travelers on trains, he actively avoided racial topics of conversation, calling racism, quote, a great menace, unquote. Just because Mr. Silk avoided talking about race and or racism does not mean that his children were shielded from it. In fact, in Coleman's first interaction with racism, he recalls receiving, quote, an unevenness of acceptance, unquote, from his white teachers at East Orange High School. Coleman's educators did not explicitly highlight his Blackness, but their behavior toward him made him feel that his Blackness was strange and out of place at school. This is difficult to process, but completely in line with Americana. One of the most segregated and most racialized areas in this country has been education. I'm going to pause here because I see the time, and I think it's probably time for a break to see if anyone has any questions. Or I guess I should turn it over to Professor Sinkoff to ask for questions.
Sorry, my video was a little crazy. Yeah, so a question people have to you about this novel, which has so many themes in it, but one of them you showed was this kind of question of political correctness on the university campus, which is during the quote Clinton years, right? Mm-hmm. So how do you see that relevance today? Do you see that relevance today? I mean, this is sort of a big question, which has a little bit less to do with racial passing, but, I guess, what do you think Roth's take was, and why, you spent time with his novels, why do you think he decided to position Coleman not only as a light-skinned Black passing as a Jew, but then accused of being an anti-Black racist? I mean, it's just so Rothian and so complicated. So can you just speak to that a little? Question is, can you speak to that a little bit more?
Yes, Roth thrives on being Rothian, meaning on being complicated. And I absolutely see political correctness happening in universities today. I absolutely see it. But it's not, I would say it's not just universities, political correctness happening in academia as a whole, in K through 12 education. What I see is political correctness in education as a whole, from kindergarten till college. There are so many ways in which this is going on, with the banning of books, where the attacks on affirmative action. Folks do not often know how to talk about race, racial difference, or gender difference, or sexuality difference. And as a result, a part of that not knowing how to talk about it, our curricula across country are being changed radically all over the place. So even though I think that Roth is talking, I know Roth is commenting on political correctness from the Clinton era, it is totally relevant today. I see it in academia, of course, from my position as a college professor, but I see it all. It's just one example. That's one example. I'll give you another example. So I'm a big fan of sitcoms, like older sitcoms, and I like Jefferson's and I like Sanford and Son. When I watch some episodes now, I still laugh hysterically, but I know that if those shows, particularly episodes where they talk about race and class, sexuality, where Fred Sanford is talking smack about people who are non-Black, those shows will not survive today. And that's yet another area where we see political correctness going on. Of course, RIP to Norman Lear, who created a lot of these Black shows, who passed away earlier today.
Right. Well, and Lear, Lear from such a again, as a Jewish American, positioned himself as going after political correctness. I mean,
yes.
With that very famous show that I'm forgetting with Loretta, I'm just forgetting her name right now, but yeah, I mean, this sort of the danger of this kind of rigid definitions that do not allow for the spectrum of identities and expressions and also maturation, frankly.
Absolutely.
I think you may get to this at your second part of your talk. So if you want to wait for this question from the audience, why do you think Roth did what he did with, there are a couple of hints in Coleman reveals himself to Nathan indirectly by that word, by the use of the word, the subconscious use of the word spooks, which he must have known had a derogatory meaning. Absolutely. And also there's another time when he accuses someone of being lily white.
Yes.
And so, and Nathan, the interlocutor, he says to himself, what's going on here?
Yep.
So I'm wondering, can you reflect a little bit about how that directionality for Roth, light-skinned Black, masquerading as Jewish, exposed, accused of being a racist, lack of support from the Black colleagues. I don't know. Can you just say a little more? And then I wanted to say to one of our audience, someone named Leora or Lenora has raised her hand, but I can't see that. If you're a participant, you need to type your question in the chat, because in the webinar format, I can't see your hands raised. So please do that while Professor Ramon reflects a little bit more on, this directionality of the passing in this novel.
In short, I think Coleman is doing some Freudian slips here, and I do get to that in the next section. I'll get to that. He's doing some Freudian slips. He had to know, as somebody who was so precise with language, which he learned from his father as a classics professor, like he had to have known that spooks is a derogatory term. I have to admit, when I first encountered the human stain as a grad student 15 years ago, that was the first time I knew that was a derogatory term. I did not know that. I thought I knew all the derogatory terms, and I encountered the human stain. I found another one, spooks. Of course, he had to have known that. In terms of directionality, I think that's another commentary that Roth is making on political correctness. He's adding to the layers of irony here when it comes to political correctness. Even going back to the title of the first section, everyone knows. The question that we have to ask ourselves, everyone knows what? The first thing that's revealed is his sexual indiscretions, the first thing. But as the novel unfolds, everyone knows a lot more things about Coleman, and you've alluded to them and what he points out with to Nathan Zuckerman. So yes, I will get to it. Yes, Freudian slips, it's all coming up.
Okay, so I'm just looking for, again, I'm asking the participants again. I can't call on you. So if you can put your questions into the chat, it will be very helpful. Another aspect of the novel that I don't think you're going to talk about, it starts out because he's having a relationship with Fanya. And this is going to get him into trouble. but Roth, and again, if you're going to say more about this later, but I remember it, you know, Roth is often considered by some feminist writers to be an arch misogynist, and they go
Yes.
after him for his depictions of women. But I actually think that those readings, albeit very interesting, miss some of the characters. And Fanya, in my mind, in this novel, is a very sympathetic character. She has suffered. Coleman loves her, and she loves him.
Yes.
So anyway, I don't think that's part of what you're going to talk about. Just give everyone out there, you must read this novel, because typical of Roth's genius, it has the other political correctness that gets exposed and then ridiculed by Roth, the writer, is this assumption that all affairs are predatory.
Right. Yes, that's right. Yes, I understand that the critique of his portrayals of women, but I absolutely agree that Fanya is very sympathetic here. What I did not say earlier, and when I introduced her, she is not only half his age, but she is a housekeeper. She's impoverished. She's in an abusive marriage, and she has 2 years of a high school education.
Right.
Whereas Coleman Silk, of course, the complete opposite of all of that. So there's a lot of power dynamics here, but she's portrayed in a way to tug at our heartstrings. The power dynamics, but we need to sympathize with her. Yes, we totally do.
So someone wanted to know if you could discuss the meaning of the title, and I think you must mean the human stain. I wish the person could respond, but perhaps I think someone, that must be what they're asking about. Why do you think Roth, what's the meaning of the title, The Human Stain?
So the last section, is it the last section, or yes, the last chapter, the last big chapter of the text is called The Purifying Ritual. The Purifying Ritual. And I think there's a correlation here between the stain of race, of Blackness, and the purifying ritual. What I'm going to get to, I can summarize it here. When Coleman Silk dies, the Kaddish, am I pronounced that correctly, was recited at Jewish funerals. The Kaddish is recited at his funeral. So he is, in Nathan's words, he lived as a Jew and died as a Jew. He didn't even want his Black family attending his funeral services at the end, right? So what I think the human stain refers to, the stain aspect, I connect to the purifying ritual. There's something about Blackness that he's trying to get rid of. And that will come up in a little bit when it comes to the psychoanalytic section, but yeah, he's trying to get rid of his Blackness, that stain of Blackness. And of course, that's racism 101 in America, trying to get rid of any elements of Blackness. We can think of, the one drop rule and this idea that having one drop of Black blood makes you Black. He's trying to, the novel's depicted in a way to show that that's not the case. It's more complex than that, right? The stain of Blackness is more complex.
Just to relate to part of what you did last week and things that you and I've talked about, and also for our audience, this one drop rule in American culture really applied, of course, to Jews in Europe during the 30s. If you had one Jewish grandparent, you were considered a Jew, even if your parents had converted and you yourself were raised as a Christian. So there's this, Roth is well aware that the stain of certain ethnic status can follow people. And I think, you saw in Swede, when you quoted the passage from Swede, from American Pastoral, Swede is a character who has deep shame. He is stained, if you will. And stains, you think about Hamlet, right? Or Macbeth, right? The stain, you can rub and rub and rub.
And it's not going anywhere.
The damn spot is not coming out, right? So I think that's a really evocative way of thinking, and purification and staining is.
Oh, yes.
I think someone else has a question, but I can't see it. So I ask you again, out there in the ether, put it in the chat, but now we'll let Professor Ramon continue with the next section of this course.
Okay, so I'm going to summarize just a little bit, only because I'm looking at the time and I want to make sure I get as many points in while also respecting the fact that you have questions. So the last thing I said was about education. One way you can understand the history of racism in America is by looking at education. Of course, which has been racialized throughout the United States. One of the institutions that open up, of course, so let me take a step back. Because of the racist history of American education, Black schools open up in the 19th century to educate African Americans who were denied an education elsewhere. One of these institutions is Howard University, is still around in Washington, D.C. And I bring up Howard because it's often been depicted as the premier HBCU in the United States. Well, it's the place that Coleman Silk matriculates in. He goes to Howard University, but he does not last long there. His first week at Howard, he's called the N-word at a nearby Woolworths, and he said, this is not happening. He does not want to hear that. It is trauma. It is a trauma for him. And as a result of hearing the N-word at a nearby Woolworths, nearby to Howard University in DC, he decides he's going to transfer to NYU in New York City. So he goes from a historically Black college to a predominantly white one in New York City, NYU. Once in NYU, he assumes not a generic white identity, but a specific Jewish one. And I think there's several reasons why this is the case. For one, Coleman himself was influenced by Doc Chisner, a Jewish dentist who serves as his boxing coach in Newark. They develop a close relationship with Chisner emerging as a father figure, replacing Mr. Silk, especially after his death, after Mr. Silk's death. When a college coach visits from the University of Pittsburgh, Chisner tells Coleman to remain silent about his Blackness. His exact words, if nothing comes up, you don't bring it up. You're neither one thing nor the other. You're silky silk. That's enough, that's the deal. Indeed, it is enough, because what Doc Chisner is saying is, Doc Chisner, again, is a Jewish dentist, but he moonlights, if you will, as a boxing coach. A lot of his team, not his team, but a lot of the young people who he works with, most of them are Jewish. So what he's saying to Coleman Silk is, don't say anything about your race. By virtue of you being around other Jewish boys, any boxing coaches who are looking at you will assume that you are Jewish, okay? Another reason Coleman chooses to pass comes from the author himself. So I'm going to read an interview from Philip Roth from 2010. Coleman's choice has nothing to do, meaning Coleman's choice to pass as a Jew, has nothing to do with the ethical, spiritual, theological, or historical aspects of Judaism. It has nothing to do with wanting to belong to another we. It's a cunning choice that successfully furnishes him with a disguise in the flight from his own we. The choice is strictly utilitarian, as so much is for this man. Again, that's from Philip Roth himself. If we take Roth's words at face value, Coleman's feigned identity is less about a strict adherence to Judaism and more about his usefulness, specifically for Coleman Silk. After World War II, Jewishness became a way to complicate America's strict racial binary. According to literary critic Ross Posnock, passing as Jewish is a strategic move for Coleman, quote, seeking to be neither Black nor white. Coleman shrewdly elects a third possibility, the unequivocal form of whiteness that is post-war American Jewishness, unquote. Matthew Wilson, another literary critic, continues this line of thinking, assuming that Coleman's ultimate desire is to be unraced, since he does not want to be either Black or white or maintain an oblique angle, quote, to the American racial binary and the color line, unquote. Coleman can then pass undetected, which helps to explain the allure of his Jewish persona, since he wishes to remain inconspicuous and avoid being boxed into monolithic American whiteness. And I'm using box here particularly because he's training to be an amateur boxer. This type of passing allows Coleman to not only revise the traditional passing as white narrative trajectory, but he also highlights the interrelatedness of race and ethnicity that have characterized Black-Jewish relations in America. In other words, he chooses to pass as Jewish because it helps him to avoid the Black-white binary, and he could, quote, be anything he chooses, unquote. That's a quote from Coleman himself. Given American history, with its ethos of freedom and self-invention, Coleman takes full advantage of this in post-war New York City as a young man shunning his Black heritage. He thus leaves his family to become Silky Silk in New York, okay? He kills them off after dating 2 women consecutively, one white and one Black. After revealing his Blackness to both of them, they end their relationship. So he's in New York City passing, he dates 2 women, not at the same time, a white woman and a Black woman. He lets them know that he's Black, and they end the relationship after finding that out. He then falls in love with Iris, a Jewish woman from whom he keeps the secret of his African-American background and gains the thrill of duplicity that he lost with his previous two partners. Keeping Roth's own words in mind from above, this might be yet another reason why Coleman Silk passes as a Jew, because he falls in love with a Jewish woman and this identity eases his courtship. As I said earlier, Iris eventually dies. She suffered a stroke and died overnight while Coleman was in the midst of battling with the college after he said the derogatory term. We learned this in the chapter called Everyone Knows. Of course, the question of what everyone knows is still pertinent, for Iris died not knowing of her husband's race, thinking she married a Jewish man. What everyone knows then is that he's now been accused of racism and now involved with a younger woman. This novel that questions American sanctimony continually asks us what's worse, his sexual proclivities, his racism accusation, or his racial duplicity. Either way, Coleman's reputation is now dead as well, adding another layer to what, quote, everyone knows. In what reads as Coleman's own eulogy, he reflects on the triumph of his life, that he had, quote, pursued the most demanding curriculum, unquote, in his youth. But his entire educational prowess proves futile as he becomes increasingly bitter, irrational, and vindictive, with a distinguished career that does not end on his own term. The true curriculum that he engages in has nothing to do with classical writers from his youth. He instead spends his life engaging in what I call a race learning, transgressing boundaries of race, or learning about race. He engaged in a race learning, which I define as a trauma. When African Americans learn about race in the classroom, they then transgress those boundaries. So in other words, they learn about race in the classroom, which becomes a trauma, and then it's the first step in their racial passing. Some might read, as part of his education, some might read Coleman's utterance of spooks as a Freudian slip. A Freudian slip is a verbal or memory slip that comes from our unconscious. Said another way, Freudian slips are mistakes that might reveal our true feelings or desires in any given situation. This makes me wonder, when Coleman says spooks in class, was he really referring to absent students, or is this something he might have heard himself in his youth when he still identified as Black? He certainly faced racism, as in school, as I mentioned previously, when Doc promoted him to a boxing instructor, and some of the students did not want to box with him because they didn't want his sweat on him. Perhaps that's another level of the human stain. Even something as close as bodily fluids like sweat, some racists did not want that around them. Actually, let's go to the next slide, the one with Sigmund Freud. I invoke Freud in talking about the Freudian slip because he, like Coleman, passed using academic pursuits. Freud was a Jew from Austria in the early 20th century, a time when Jews were thought to have African origins. His own mother referred to his dark complexion in his youth, perhaps as a reflection of her own fear that he would eventually develop darker skin. In order to avoid any affinities to his Jewishness, Freud himself passed as an assimilated European. I believe that he created psychoanalysis not just to theorize the unconscious and conscious mind, but also to implicitly theorize race and racial passing. I'll now pivot briefly to the final section of this talk, a brief psychoanalytic perspective and Walt's responses to help us interpret the text. Part 3. When Coleman's mother realizes that he is now passing and will now deny her access to any future grandchildren, she does not mince words in speaking with him. I'm going to quote extensively here from Coleman's mom. "You've been giving fair warning almost from the day you got here. You were seriously disinclined even to take the breast. Yes, you were. Now I see why. Even that might delay your escape. There was something about our family, and I don't mean color. There was always something about us that impeded you. You think like a prisoner. You do, Coleman Brutus. You're as white as the snow and you think like a slave." Unquote. Mrs. Silk interprets her son's rejection of her breast milk as the initial act of foreshadowing that suggests he never wanted to be Black in the first place. Her exasperation evokes psychoanalyst Melanie Klein's theorization. Klein argues that the primary experiences of an infant are divided into two opposing states, good objects and bad objects, which are manifested in their mother's breasts. The good breast according to Klein, provides nourishment and is the most desired one. Whereas the bad breast, quote unquote, is the one that does not feed the infant, leading to hunger. The bad breast then becomes the object of malevolence for the child, who fears abandonment because of lack of food. This good breast, bad breast theory is an accurate lens through which to view Coleman's silk. If the theory represents split opposing entities, then applying her theory to Coleman raises the issue of whether his psychological splitting is race-based and that the breasts represent his internal racialized duality. If Mrs. Silk's assumption is accurate, then the newborn Coleman felt, quote, disinclined to even take the breast, unquote, because he equated the bad breast with the blackness that he eventually shuns. Coleman's own, I'm going to skip a little bit, and because I see the time, I'm going to talk a little bit about Coleman's death, which, actually, can we go to the next slide? When it comes to Coleman's death. Oh, whoops, that's not, okay, sorry. We can keep it there. We can keep it there. Basically, what I want to argue about Coleman's death, another level of psychoanalysis, is Freud's death drive. And I believe that Coleman Silk wanted to die. So the death drive states that as humans, we have an internal desire to die, basically, if we have, I'm trying to summarize it quickly. According to Freud, if we have an eternal desire to die, a death wish, especially when things that are untenable presents itself to us. So in other words, when we are presented with things that we cannot face, that are untenable to us, the inclination is to die in order to avoid some of those untenable things. My argument is that for Coleman Silk, being racialized was untenable to him, and he wanted to die. And that is a provocative argument because his death, and I don't want to reveal too much, but his death takes up a lot of the narrative. We get a lot of details surrounding Coleman's death. What we don't get are specific reasons as to why he's dead. I think that is Walt's way of leading us, of putting the onus on us as readers to interpret why is it that this racial pastor had to die. I believe he wanted to die. I believe he had a death wish and wanted to die. So if you take Melanie Klein's theorization of the good breast and bad breast, and Sigmund Freud's ideas of death drive, you can totally use those ideas as a starting point to how to see the psychoanalytic elements of Coleman Silk's racialized identity. So when it comes to, let me get back here. Though some literary critics believe that Roth's early writings antagonized psychoanalysis, he reconciled with it by the time he wrote The Human Stain, as evidenced by characterizing Coleman in ways that support theories by Freud and Klein. They come from different strands of psychoanalysis, yet the field itself began with Freud's anxiety over sexuality and race, as evidenced by his own references to mixed race and blackness in his work. Thus, for Roth to pen a passing narrative, he simultaneously had to evoke canonical passing narratives and psychoanalysis, since to my mind, they are interrelated. So now I'm going to get to a conclusion. Inevitably, when I teach this book to students, often in the class on racial passing, I get a variation of this question: who is this book about? I don't think that's a fair question. I think the real question is, what is this book about? Now, Philip Roth vacillated in who the book was about in his later years. As you see here, you see an open letter to Wikipedia. He wrote this open letter to Wikipedia to tell them to take off the reference. So The Human Stain has a Wikipedia page. He wanted Wikipedia to take off the reference to Anatole Boyard, who was a real-life racial passer. He was a Creole man who passed as white to be the New York Times book critic. Roth himself told Wikipedia that is not the case, take down that reference. And Wikipedia did not take it down. It just says alleged. There are alleged connections between Anatole Boyard and Coleman Silk. There are alleged connections. Another example, and we can go to the next slide, please. Another example is Mel Tuman, or another person who could be Coleman Silk's inspiration is Mel Tuman, who was a real-life racial passer. In the image here, you see Anatole Boyard at the top and Mel Tuman at the bottom. Tuman was a sociology professor at Princeton University for 3 decades. And one day during class discussion, this happened to him, and this is according to Roth himself. Having finished taking the role, Mel queried the class about these 2 students whom he had never met. Does anyone know these people? Do they exist, or are they spooks? Unfortunately, the very words that Coleman Silk, the protagonist of The Human Stain, asked of his classics class at Athena College in Massachusetts. So according to Coleman himself, Anatole Boyard is not the inspiration. That's just us as readers and literary critics have seen that connection. According to Roth, the connection is Mel Tuman, whose picture you see at the bottom here. Princeton then investigated him, but he emerged unscathed of the charge of hate speech. As with Coleman Silk, the charge of racism is ironic, since Tuman built his career as a white man who first gained prominence as a liberal-leaning scholar of the segregation in the 1950s. Yet, in supporting his claims, Roth points to precise distinctions between Coleman Silk and Anatole Boyard, the latter of whom is described as a man he barely knew, and who he met only a few times over 3 decades. Yet he knew Tuman closely, and he must have heard of the hushed insinuations that Tuman's complexion, lips, hair, and an area of study, which is race relations, suggested that he was a black man passing as Jewish. Again, no different from Coleman Silk. So I'm going to skip, because I see the time, I'm going to skip a little bit to the bottom here, to my conclusion. I don't think it's right to say, who is this book about? I think what we need to ask is, what is this book about? And that is a more complex question. If we force a comparison between The Human Stain and any of the aforementioned potential muses, we run the risk of limiting what we take away from the text. Instead of asking who is about, it's more generative to ask what is about. As Roth reminds, and Roth reminds readers that the word past does not appear at all in The Human Stain, which he hopes would further differentiate Boyard's life from Silk's fictional one. Though the word is absent from the novel, the concept was very much present during these men's lives. I would argue that he couldn't make a series such as the American trilogy without including the images, tropes, and themes that characterize America. These include race and racial passing. Roth himself offers a compelling reason for why many African Americans felt obliged to pass. They imagined, quote, that they would not have to share in the deprivations, humiliations, injuries, insults, and injuries that would be more likely to come their way should they leave their identities exactly as they found them, unquote. Racial passing is hardly a selfish endeavor. It is also a matter of safety and social mobility, often instilled in African Americans through traumatic encounters. Coupled with this is a history of anti-Black discrimination and anti-Semitism in the United States. As long as these two persist, efforts to circumvent will also persist. And The Human Stain demonstrates that what, quote, everyone knows, The Human Stain demonstrates, quote, what everyone knows by reading the text. Passing is a distinctly American phenomenon, both in writers' imagination and in real life. Blacks and Jews will continue to navigate the color line, and no amount of movement or political correctness could mediate this. Next slide, and thank you. Thank you.
So thank you so much. So I do have a question that's coming up from the chat, which is, what prompted you as a literary scholar to journey sort of into psychoanalytic theory to explain literature? You know, that is an unusual move, and people are curious about how that happened.
It is very unusual. And I was, as a grad student at Rutgers, I knew I wanted to write about racial passing. I just didn't know what the theory would be. I wanted to write about racial passing narratives. But of course, the literature, you have to have a theoretical background, a theoretical framework for racial passing. I didn't know what it would be. And I have to shout out Professor Michelle Stevens. I hope she's on this call. Michelle Stevens was my professor. She taught a class called Race and Psychoanalysis in 2011. That was my last year of coursework. And I took that class and I learned so much about race and psychoanalysis. And through that class, I delved deeper into psychoanalysis, which was created by Freud. It's historically been seen as a white or European way of understanding folks. But I think there's some racial elements there. And I wanted to challenge myself to apply this historically what's considered white theory to Black texts. And in doing so, I found a lot of scholarship that's been by and about Black folks writing about psychoanalysis. A pivotal book for me is Claudia Tate's Race and Psychoanalysis, where she understands or she closely reads Black novels and psychoanalysis from maybe 30 years ago. That opened up the doors for me and made me think, okay, this idea, this theory that has not been apply to African Americans historically, I can do so. So honestly, that's the long answer. The short answer, Michelle Stevens is amazing. Take her class if she ever teaches a course called Racial Psychoanalysis. That got me on this path.
She's pretty busy now. I'm not sure she has such active teaching because of her high position, but you know, everything you've said about the pressures for light-skinned Blacks to pass, really, it's so analogous with the Jewish experience in Europe. And it's less about skin color, but it is about humiliation, lack of legal opportunity, shaming, being considered effeminate, you know, all the tropes. And then you have other things, anti-Semitic tropes about power. I mean, that's the complexity of anti-Semitism, which it not only depicts Jews as powerless, it depicts them as powerful.
Right.
But you know, one can't, I mean, you know, Freud, Roth is now gone, and he was famously reluctant to talk about himself.
Right.
It's hard to get at what he was. He wasn't the kind of writer who said, well, I wrote this book because, and he was never going to do that. But I think that many people today don't understand the social discrimination against Jews before World War II and after World War II. Before World War II, Jews were considered Oriental, quote, Asian, with all kinds of stereotypes that they actually weren't white and that they wouldn't assimilate into white society. And Roth, of course, is aware of that. And then after the war, when Jews in the 20th century, Jews do become coded as white and do pass as a group into white society in many ways. But the legacy of the trauma of the destruction of the Jews of Europe, and so many American Jews are descendants of European Jews, not Middle Eastern Jews, right? They're Ashkenazim, means that even the most successful white light-skinned Jew who is passed as American, right behind him or her is this terror, which is very similar, again, analogous to a successful Black person. Right behind him or her is the terror of the lynching. So I think that it's not that these are the same phenomenon,
right?
But Roth, given his genius again, is acutely aware of this. And you know, even in Goodbye Columbus, he has a Black character, you know, because, and you've said this, we've talked about this in other ways, you know, Jews and Blacks interact in American urban spaces. And Newark was, you know,
prime example, New York City. Yep.
Newark was his, you know, I can't ever pronounce Faulkner's regional home, but you know, Pottawattamie County, you know, that was his vortex, was Newark, the urbanism of Newark, the multicultural, the Black and Jewish aspects of Newark. So I guess all I'm trying to say is that I think that Roth, as a coded white yet distinctly Jewish writer, is acutely aware of the way Jewish minority status had to be negotiated, and he sees similarities and yet differences, of course, in the Black experience, and he's not Black, and nor would he ever pretend to be. So I think that's part of what makes him such an American writer, actually.
Yes, I think so too. In addition to all the themes that he likes to talk about, race, class, movement, social mobility, physical movement, and or social mobility, these are things that are quintessentially American, and they also come up in the American trilogy when it comes to political correctness at different points in American history, 20th century American history.
Right. So I don't see any other questions. Again, if people raise their hands, I want to tell everyone, I'm now giving you more work, Professor Ramon, but if someone has a question for you later and you haven't thought about NATO, please send it to me, care of the Bildner Center, and I'll make sure it gets to Professor Ramon. And I want to just remind everyone that we have another session where we'll talk about another extraordinary American novel by Nella Larson entitled Passing, which really became the framework for this mini course that Donovan designed. And that's next week, same time, same Zoom link. So please join us. And I want to thank the staff, Sarah Portilla, Darcy Marr, Robin Arabak, and Amanda Gravenheis, because they're behind the scenes, making sure that the publicity for the courses get out, the YouTubes and everything gets edited, the slides work even when there's glitchiness, etc. So I want to thank them. And I also want to tell everyone that besides Professor Munn's last class, we have the new semester will be upon us very soon. And we have a virtual program in January, right after the semester starts, by an esteemed colleague at Brandeis, Yehuda Mirsky, and he will be giving a talk called Mystical Zionism's Surprising Origins, Rav Kook's Early Decades. And I can assure you it will be terrific, and also introduce those of you who know something about Rav Kook to very surprising elements of his Zionist aspirations. And of course, in our moment today, learning about the diversity and the complexity and the non-binary nature of Jewish national aspirations is very, very important. So I hope you'll join us. And thank you, everyone. Be safe, and we'll see you next week.
All right. Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone.